Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to 1993 to an event that occurred in Wilmington, North Carolina, right down the road from where we sit as we record our podcast today. And that is the accidental shooting of movie star Brandon Lee. And Chris, I'm not one to keep up with Hollywood or what's going on in the entertainment industry, but this is one of those stories that I remember. I was when this particular event happened, I was in high school, and I remember hearing about the death of Brandon Lee.
Well, I think many people, I guess our generation would be familiar with Brandon Lee, but especially his father, who was Bruce Lee, who was a noted martial arts artist as well as actor who starred in numerous movies. And I think that, we talk about the connections of history, and Ray, this is a devastating event that takes place on a acting or active Hollywood set in the making of a very famous movie. But Ray, has got connotations to even just recently when we see something very similar that happened on another set just in the recent few years that involves a tragedy like what happened to Brandon Lee.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think about the situation with Alec Baldwin in 2021, and you think going back to what happened here with Brandon Lee in 1993, there's some haunting similarities in that mistakes made with props ended up costing someone their life. Now, this all went down, like I said earlier, on March 31st, 1993, in Wilmington, here in North Carolina, at what at the time was called Carol Co Studios. Right now, it's the Screen Gem Studios. And for people who do not know, they actually have quite an active filming industry in Wilmington. They've done such TV shows down there as Matlock, Dawson's Creek, One Tree Hill. The latest Halloween movie was filmed down there. They have a very active studio down there in Wilmington, and that is where this particular incident took place on March 31st, March 31st, 1993. He was filming a movie called The Crow, which I cannot remember, Chris, if I've ever seen that movie. It almost sounds like a movie I would like, but I cannot remember for the life of me when I was thinking about this, had I ever seen the movie. Part of it looked familiar to me, but I'm thinking I cannot really remember much of the movie if I ever saw it.
Yeah, The Crow was one of those cult movies, if you will, and it's gathered even more of a following because of the accidental death of Brandon Lee. But it was a supernatural superhero film. I think you could probably say it's the film that came before the Avengers and Marvel and all of these other kind of superhero movies that have become pretty famous now. But it's a very interesting movie that deals with murder and romance and kind of a whodunit, and it's got this eerie feel to it. I think the one thing that I've never watched the movie because, Ray, if people go back and watch our Halloween episodes, I just don't like this kind of stuff, if you will. And Ray, it wasn't as bad as the cover of the book but seeing the movie poster for The Crow really messed me up because you've got this sinister looking dude who's got this like painted face, and then there's this image of the crow, and it's very spooky, it's very eerie, but it really was this cult following, even though I don't think it really did a lot when it first came out. I think what made it so good or so famous is because of Brandon Lee and what happened to him while the movie was being produced.
Yeah, his death on the set of that show or movie probably did a lot to, I hate to say this, to help the show, to help the movie itself. So what's going on here is they are filming there at the studios here in Wilmington. And his character is supposed to walk into his apartment. When he walks into his apartment, his fiance or wife, girlfriend, whatever, is being assaulted. Okay. And I think he's supposed to encounter these bad guys, and one of them is supposed to turn around and shoot the Brandon Lee's character, I guess, who after this would become the Crow. Unfortunately, even though they were supposed to be using a blank, we'll talk about after I explain what happened. When Lee was shot, he fell down, and turns out he had actually been shot instead of just a blank. Because you know what a blank does? Blanks are exactly what they say. Nothing comes out of the gun. The gun, it's got the blast, it's got the sound, it's got all of that, but there's no projectile actually exiting the gun. In this particular case, a projectile from what they had done previously with this particular gun did exit the gun, and it hit Lee in the abdomen, where when he fell down. And from my reading, I understand he fell back. He fell forward and was supposed to fall backwards. And when they yelled cut, people did not even realize at the moment that he had been shot. It wasn't until someone went up to him and realized that he had actually been shot. And he was taken to the hospital, where he subsequently died of his injuries.
And, we have to remember this is back in 1993. Movie producers, directors are wanting to make these movies as realistic as possible, but they didn't have the CGI and the other effects and the different things that are available today to make these events look so realistic. And, I guess it's an ethical, especially with the recent events that's happened with Alec Baldwin, there's this ethical dilemmas about, how realistic do you want it to be? I mean, you have this real gun that just have these, as you mentioned, the blank rounds, which has a powder charge and a primer. It just doesn't have the bullet. So you can get the pop and the I guess the smoke or the rise from it makes it look realistic. And I think what gets me is, you are supposed to go through all of these checks. You have all these people that are on set who have specific jobs, and one of them being like the equipment handler, the one who handles the props. And Ray, they're supposed to check each of the elements. This being a gun, they're supposed to check the gun, make sure that everything's loaded properly, everything's done right, because you don't want an accident to happen. I mean, you have to be very careful. And when this happens, it seems that everybody had checked off that everything was fine, everything was ready, but they had forgotten to see that there was this dummy bullet that had been used in a previous set, which they hadn't looked at. And in my understanding of that, I guess, and I'm not a gun fanatic, I don't know much about guns, but I guess it's that one in the chamber that you can't see, the one that you can't really tell. You can look inside and see where you load that everything's clean, but that one in the chamber, nobody properly checked it. And even when he fell, it still looked like a regular part of the movie or the scene. And many people thought that he was just acting it out a little bit longer. Maybe he was joking. Maybe this was just, him taking a little extra breather. Nobody really knew anything until, as you mentioned, one of the other actors kind of go over there and said something's not right, but once again, Ray, it hits him in the abdomen, but Ray, there's no bleeding. So, I mean, it once, even now, it doesn't look like that he's been shot, that a bullet has actually pierced his body. I mean, it's just like, maybe he fell, maybe he bumped his head, maybe something's happened. So I think, Ray, there was just a lot of confusion at that moment. And they even take his pulse, I believe, and he's got a pretty normal pulse. But then just like that, things start to change.
Yeah, things changed pretty fast. And we have to remember this, they were filming in the middle of the night when this occurred. This was not a scene that was filmed during the day. And of course, being it's a studio, the time of day doesn't really matter. But they were filming outside. When the paramedics were called and the paramedics got to the movie studio, they took him to New Hanover Regional Medical Center, where he was in surgery for about 6 hours before he was pronounced dead around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on March 31st, 1993. So, I mean, this is a very tragic end to a very young life. I mean, he was only 28 years old when when this happened to him. And Chris, at one point in my life, I remember when I turned 28 thinking, oh, where's my cane and walker? And now I look back at 28 and go, that's a kid.
Right. Well, and I mean, this guy had his whole career in front of him.
Yes.
I mean, he was, not only did he have the family name of Lee, but he was a good actor. I mean, he was very gifted at what he did. And so when this happens, you have just a lot of people who had been following him and had really started to develop, a cult following, if you will, because he brought a lot of similarities like his dad. But then there started to be these questions, well, how does a 28-year-old on a set, how does he pass away from, this dummy bullet, if you will? And, it's interesting to me is that as they began to investigate, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that come up because, Ray, one of the other things that happens with this is that his father actually dies at a very young age, like Brandon. So this creates a lot of discussion as to what's the conspiracy theory, but just a lot of not so random. What's the word?
Not a lot of questions, not a coincidence.
There you go. Not a coincidence. And, I found it pretty interesting, just kind of studying a little bit of those conspiracy theories as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So he dies. He has a funeral on April 3rd where he's buried beside his father there in Seattle, Washington. A lot of very famous people, of course, attend the funeral there. And not surprisingly, and I think justifiably so, Chris, his mom, Linda Lee Caldwell, files a lawsuit against the production company because of the death of her son. It doesn't actually go to trial like many lawsuits. It's settled out of court, but the terms have never really been disclosed. So earlier when we were researching this, Chris, I found a newspaper clip from the News and Observer, the Durham edition, from Thursday, April 1st, 1993. And by the way, how much is a newspaper today, by the way? I don't know.
Do they still sell newspapers?
I see them in the little things, but this one was 50 cents.
That's what it used to be. I used to love collecting newspapers and reading newspapers. It was a highlight. If I could get a newspaper, Ray, it was just something. And, that's a whole other thing. But you think about newspapers, because the newspapers that we would get always told yesterday's story.
Yep.
I mean, that's why I said, do they even exist today? Because newspapers are so out of date, because people just click on their phones, click on the computer, and can get up to date, minute by minute understandings. Forget about what happened last night.
Yeah. Yeah. And it says the headline is "Injury on Set Kills Actor. Unknown projectile blamed for Brandon Lee's death. Wilmington." Quote, "Actor Brandon Lee, son of the late martial arts star Brandon Lee, died Wednesday from injuries received while filming in a stunt scene at a Wilmington movie studio. Police are unsure exactly what killed him. He was struck in the stomach by a projectile while filming a scene in which another actor shot at him from about 15 feet away with a gun rigged to fire blanks. Lee was holding a grocery bag that contained a small explosive charge designed to simulate gunfire hitting the bag. He collapsed immediately after the shots were fired, and the charge of the bag went off. Police said it's not clear whether the projectile that killed Lee came from the gun, the bag, or another source. Lee was taken to New Hanover Regional Medical Center about 1 a.m. Wednesday and died about 12 hours later. Dr. Warren W. McMurray, the surgeon, said intestinal injuries and major vascular injuries were consistent with a bullet wound, end quote. So I guess it was just because I know there's a lot. I'm not an anatomy expert or a doctor, but I know there's a lot of vessels and arteries and stuff in the abdomen, and even an injury that may not on the surface look life threatening definitely was in this case.
Yeah, and go back to kind of dad. What's weird is that Bruce Lee, the father, this well-known martial arts guru, was filming a movie that I remember that movie. It was called Game of Death,
Oh
and
yeah.
it was about this retired champion martial artist who had kind of to fight his way to the top. Kind of like Karate Kid
Mhm.
on steroids, I guess. And he had to do it to be able to save his brother and sister. And well, while that film was being or made, Bruce Lee dies. And so they have to kind of change the whole thing, about how the story takes place or whatever.
Right.
And then what happens is the plot changes to where there's this international martial arts movie star who goes after like this gang, this crime boss lord or whatever. And what's interesting is that this guy is shot, right? And he's shot and he's killed. And what's interesting is that when Brandon Lee was killed after being shot with a prop gun, people started to see the similarities, right, between Bruce Lee's last movie and Brandon Lee's last movie. To the point, one last thing, that the mom that you mentioned who filed a suit and was trying to claim damages for this horrendous accident, basically said also that there was a curse with her son Brandon, because Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in the year of the dragon, called Little Phoenix and all of that. But before Brandon was born, his parents had lost another son. And according to ancient Chinese tradition, if you didn't refer to him by like a male name, it would confuse the spirits. And so she believed that might have had some input also. So you start getting into some really deep stuff as to what happened with Brandon. But at the end of the day, this was a terrible tragedy. And we talk all the time that in history, we must make sure that history does not repeat itself.
Mm,
But Ray,
it
as
did.
you just mentioned, in 2021, pretty much the same exact thing takes place on another movie set involving a gun that was improperly checked, and it killed someone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd think the lesson would have been learned after one, but apparently not. And of course, those are not the only two times. The situation with Brandon Lee and the situation with Alec Baldwin, these are not the only two accidents that have occurred on movie sets. These are not the only two times people have been killed on movie sets, but these are just two very high profile times that something like this is happening. Interestingly enough, shortly before his death, I found a quote that he quoted in an interview, and it's actually, I think some or all of this is actually on his tombstone, Chris. And it's always sometimes very interesting, sometimes eerily so. Someone will say something before their death, maybe a few days or whatever before their death, and after the fact, people look to that and say, well, did this person know something was coming or whatever? And I sometimes wonder about that. But he said the following, and he's quoting from a book, and it's quote, and this is what he says, quote, "Because we don't know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood, an afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4 or 5 more times? Perhaps not even that. And how many more times will you watch a full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless," end quote. So, the fact that I don't know how long before his death that he quoted that passage from that book. It's eerie in that he, even at such a young age, he seemed to have a perspective that, life is not forever and everything has a last time.
Yeah, and as we live in this age, we see all around us just times of sadness and of hurt and of war. And I think that his final thoughts, in that interview are still here today, and it is a reminder for every single one of us to go and live life, to go and enjoy life, to go and make a difference in everything you do, because everything happens, as you mentioned, a certain number of times, and it is really very small. I mean, Ray, we talk off air about that we're getting older and a lot of things begin to hurt and things of that nature, but the reality is we might not have the afternoons like what we used to think of. We might not have the sunsets, and so we have to give for it our best effort each and every day, because we're only guaranteed this one breath.
That's absolutely true. And on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Please share the podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.